Hello there. Welcome into a Thursday edition of the show. So glad to have you, whether you're listening on your radio, streaming the show online at extrasports1300.com, or you've downloaded the Extra Sports 1300 app to do your listening. And that app, which is free to download and free to use, is sponsored by Diversus Health, Mental Health, and Well-Being for All. A veritable cornucopia of sports topics coming your way over the course of the program. Week 12 in the NFL, which the Broncos are going to sit out, begins tonight with the Bills and the Texans. Our coverage from Westwood One begins at 5:30. That gives us plenty of time to accomplish what at least I am setting out to accomplish, but I could use your help. If you'd like to chat with me, you can do so by calling or texting in to 719-247-1313. Want to start with the Denver Nuggets and what happened last night. There are a few Nuggets-related topics I want to get into over the course of the program, but let's start with this one. I think but more importantly, the Denver Nuggets need to learn the lessons or remember the lessons that were taught to them the last couple of years in terms of roster construction, in terms of what you can live without and what you can't. Last night, in the Nuggets' 125-118 win over the Pelicans, Peyton Watson, who is a pending restricted free agent, scored 32 points and grabbed 12 rebounds. Which, when you have a performance like that, I think it reminds people, oh yeah, he might not be a Denver Nugget for long. And then the feeling of, oh, Peyton Watson's finally starting to hit. It's paying dividends now. They're getting that ROI. Look at Peyton Watson, the way he's played. And look, last night he puts up big numbers, but he's absolutely been impactful up until last night. So the feeling about Peyton Watson, I think, just intensified after last night's game. Now, it's important to know, and I don't want to, completely bog down this conversation because I think it's an important conversation, but I will just throw out there that, remember, Jonathan Kuminga and Josh Giddey were both restricted free agents. So the idea that if the Nuggets don't give Peyton Watson a large contract, that he's gone is just, it may not be the case, because we saw with Josh Giddey that the Bulls decided, we do want to give you a big contract. With the Warriors, they didn't want to do that for a long time with Jonathan Kuminga. Okay, so the Nuggets still hold the cards here. When you're a restricted free agent in the NBA, it's not a fun place to be. And I think that's part of the reason why Peyton Watson has enlisted the help of Rich Paul and Clutch Sports to ensure that he, or at least go a long way to ensure that he gets a big pay bump next year. Right? Whether that's another team swooping in and signing him to an offer sheet, or it's the Denver Nuggets locking him up long term. But the Nuggets do control their destiny in a way when it comes to Peyton Watson, because it's a very powerful thing in the player empowerment era for a team to have a guy's restricted free agency rights. But let's just take the longer term view here. Let's not worry about whether it's just right after this year or not. There will come a day where the Nuggets got to decide, whether Peyton Watson is in the long-term plans or not. And getting back to my original statement of we have to be careful, and more importantly, the Nuggets have to be careful with falling in love with players who look really good next to Nikola Jokic. Just look at the last 3 games for the Denver Nuggets. Okay? 4 games ago, Christian Brown gets hurt. Right? The very first game without Christian Brown, who they paid, by the way. Right? They decided, despite the flexibility they gained by trading Michael Porter, they immediately turned around and gave Christian Brown not all of that money, but they signed him to an extremely lucrative contract. Okay? Which I think has a chance to age better than Michael Porter's, but I still somewhat disagree with the thought process behind it, and that's what I'm going to get into here. So Christian Brown gets hurt. First game without Christian Brown, they put Tim Hardaway in the lineup, and Tim Hardaway scores 23 points on 5 of 6 shooting from deep as the Nuggets pick up their biggest win of the season to date against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, next game after that, Cam Johnson returns from injury. We have a Cam Johnson game. Now, he's in a little bit of a different boat, but I'll loop him into the conversation because he's going to be one of these guys too. Cam Johnson has a crazy game. And no, Nuggets won the trade. Not only did they get the flexibility, but they got a better player than Michael Porter. Like, some of that conversation went on. And then last night, you have Peyton Watson. He didn't start. Zeke Naji started for David Adelman said it was because he matches up physically with Zion Williamson, which, okay, whatever you say. But that was just a piece of trivia. The main part of it was that Peyton Watson got a lot of minutes with Nikola Jokic and scored 32 points and 12 rebounds. You have to decide whether these guys are core to your future, or are they just guys that are being elevated by the best player in the world? And it's difficult. It's a difficult thing to do because you watch these guys play with Jokic and you're like, and I'll raise my hand. I'll tell you where I fell victim to this. When they let KCP walk, I said, how can you let this guy go? Christian Brown's not going to be as good as KCP. And if we wanted to get into semantics, he probably wasn't. Right? He probably wasn't better than Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. But the real impact of the Nuggets letting KCP walk and elevating Christian Brown to the starting 5 was that their bench got weaker. That was the real negative impact of losing Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. Not the impact on the starting 5. They were just fine. Even though you could say that Christian Brown may not have been as good as KCP was during the title run. But the real effects were felt in the second unit with the depth of this team. So what did Ben Tenzer and John Wallace go out and do this offseason? They traded Porter. They took a guy that looked, despite some people's complaining about Michael Porter, looked pretty good playing with Nikola Jokic more often than not, right? But they said, that is not as important to us as getting the flexibility to be able to fill the bench. And time will tell whether Cam Johnson is actually a better player than Michael Porter with the Denver Nuggets. Certainly you don't see it so far. We have to be fair to the situation and give Michael Porter credit for what he did and say Cam Johnson a dozen games in does not look better than or more important than Michael Porter looked or was to the Denver Nuggets. But time will tell. If the Nuggets decide that they have finally the seeds they have planted with Peyton Watson are now bearing fruit, And that's a hard thing to give up on. Right? You put so much time and energy, you watch these guys grow, you're invested in the development, and then when it finally clicks, you're like, man, you want to keep that guy. You want to continue to rake in that ROI. But if they sign Peyton Watson, it's going to put them in the exact same spot they were in with the Michael Porter Jr. contract. If they're not kind of tiptoeing into that territory anyway by signing Christian Brown. The bottom line here is that the Denver Nuggets have to look at what they do moving forward with Ben Tenzer and John Wallace co-running the front office. No matter what. Okay, obviously you keep Jokic around for as long as you can. And if this Jamal Murray that you see is what you believe if it continues to be that way, Jamal Murray, his importance to this team is larger than most people's, right? But beyond that, their thought to me always has to be with, do we have enough depth? And if we need to let a guy go, like a Peyton Watson, in order to make sure that we open up some money to be able to sign the next Jonas Valanciunas, because, face it, I think Jonas Valanciunas is a one-year deal. I think he's gone after this year. You got to find someone to replace him, right? Not going to be easy. Tim Hardaway, how long is he going to be around? Nobody wants to go back to the Calvin Booth line of thinking, right? We'll just put young guys in there, Deron Holmes, Julian Strawther, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody wants to go back to that. But the guys that the Nuggets have now, those are veterans. They cost more. And I know that Peyton Watson ultimately is a depth guy. But if you can pay two veterans what you're paying Peyton Watson, that's better. Even if Peyton Watson looks like a better player than either of the two that you would eventually bring in. The Nuggets have to, if they want to extend their title window out, for as long as Nikola Jokic wants to play in the NBA and is the best player in the league. We've seen this. That's the thing that's right, staring us right in the face. Everything is better if Nikola Jokic can just breathe for a minute. If he could just sit down and rest without being dragged back out on the floor because the Nuggets cough up whatever lead they had. The depth of the Nuggets is actually making Jokic better. And if you have a better Jokic, which he had another monster triple-double last night, had it through three quarters, everybody else around him looks better because of the way Jokic plays. This new front office cannot fall into the same trap with the collective bargaining agreement and the financial part of the NBA the way it is now. They cannot fall in to the same thought processes that previous regimes had, which is, man, our starting five is amazing. We got to keep it together. That's the old thinking. Times have changed. So it's great that Peyton Watson had that kind of a game last night. Credit to him. Credit to the Denver Nuggets for sticking with him, for developing him, because even in smaller roles than he had last night, he's been very good. But if this is all building up to this career year for Peyton Watson, and you know the way that Clutch Sports operates, if they're going to try and demand top dollar, the Nuggets have to be willing to say goodbye to him. Or I'll present an alternative, which I don't think anybody wants to hear, but I'll put it out there anyway. you need to trade Aaron Gordon. There's not room for both of these guys long-term on the roster. Either you go do the same thing where you elevate Brown in for KCP. You do it with Peyton Watson for Aaron Gordon. And you trade Aaron Gordon and open up flexibility. I mean, you just can't keep paying everybody. That's the harsh lessons that the Nuggets have learned in the last few years of this new CBA. You can't pay everyone. And if you're going to pay Peyton Watson, it's going to cost you somebody. And you don't want it to cost you your depth or your flexibility to be able to acquire more depth pieces. So to me, if Peyton Watson has a job long-term on this Nuggets team, it has to come at the expense of Aaron Gordon. And I told you that's a conversation no one wants to have. So what do I do with Peyton Watson in the meantime? With all of this? I start shopping him. I don't believe that Peyton Watson, as good as he's been, I don't think Peyton Watson ultimately by himself makes the difference between the Nuggets winning a championship this year or not. I start shopping him. I say, who wants his RFA rights, which, again, as I said, are very valuable. And when there's a league where players come and go as they please, to have restricted free agency rights is a big deal. I would start shopping him. And I would add something in there. Because you don't just give up Peyton Watson for nothing. Right? You got to sell high on this guy. If he keeps going this way, I say, I don't need much in return, because my thinking, if I'm Ben Tenzer and John Wallace, is I want to keep my flexibility. That's the most important thing. I say we got this guy. We started him last night because supposedly he's a good physical matchup for Zion Williamson, and he proceeded to score 0 points. I say you want Peyton Watson, and he's an RFA. You control him past this year. Take Zeke Najee's contract too. The Nuggets have tried 8 different ways to be able to unload the Zeke Naji contract. The only way they're going to do it is if they give something of real value to someone else. And Peyton Watson at a low number this year with restricted free agency coming up after the season, maybe, I'm not saying it gets it done, but I'm saying maybe this presents you another avenue to try and dump the contract of Zeke Naji. And if you do that, not only do you not have to pay Peyton Watson, now you have Zeke Najee's contract off the books. So to me, the most significant development out of last night and Peyton Watson going off like he did was that maybe his trade value goes up to the point that you can finally get rid of Zeke Najee's contract, be leaner and meaner, and have more flexibility moving forward to continue to replenish the depth, not by drafting and developing, but by going out and getting the next Jonas Valanciunas, the next Tim Hardaway. 719-247-1313. Take your thoughts on that. Again, another monster night from Nikola Jokic, which is adding to a monster decade or half decade, as it were, for Nikola Jokic. I want to get into that conversation coming up. Coming up next, if you go out to the sports books to maybe place your wager on the Broncos winning the Super Bowl, and you might be expecting less value, that's not necessarily the case. Are the Broncos being disrespected despite knocking off the Kansas City Chiefs? Want to alert you about something we're doing tomorrow that you can participate in person or remotely. It's Take a Turkey to Work Day. It's an annual thing that we do, partnering with Care and Share Food Bank of Southern Colorado to help families in Southern Colorado have the Thanksgiving that they deserve. The premise essentially is, as you're heading into work, drop off a turkey. We'll be at, or representatives from our stations. Full disclosure, I'm traveling with Air Force women's basketball, but we will be at the King Soopers at Mark Shuffle and Constitution, we being our radio cluster. So if you listen to other radio stations, whether it be KKFM or Magic, KVOR, representatives from those stations will be out all day. At that particular King Soopers, you can also, they're accepting the turkey drop-offs at any King Soopers location in Colorado Springs. In Pueblo, of course, there's another aspect. You could go to extrasports1300.com and make an online donation. And remember, food banks are able to buy more with $1 than you and I can as consumers. And that's a good thing because we want these food banks to be able to feed as many people as they can. So either way, if you can donate, we would be eternally grateful for that, and you'd be helping out needy families here in Southern Colorado. It's Take a Turkey to Work Day, sponsored by Bullseye Plumbing, Heating, and Air. Help us take aim at hunger with Bullseye. Getting to your text here from the 719, talking about Peyton Watson's breakout game last night and why I caution people not to fall in love with Peyton Watson. Okay, maybe he is popping here in whatever year this is for him, year 4. Maybe he is. Maybe all the Nuggets' work to develop him is finally paying off, and you want to hang on to that. I get that natural inclination, but we are just seeing it this season that is so much more important for the Denver Nuggets to have cheap depth. And Peyton Watson is not going to be cheap depth anymore. Once he gets his next contract, he's going to be well compensated. And I already turned up my nose a little bit about the re-signing of Christian Braun for the same reason. Now, I think because of how you didn't give Christian Braun, Michael Porter money, so it has a chance to age a little bit better, but it's again, the thought of, because I did this with KCP and I said, oh, how could you bear losing this guy? Starting 5 last year wasn't the problem, right? Same thing here. Right? You got to be wary of a guy who looks really good playing with Nikola Jokic. And I've even questioned Jamal Murray a little bit in that regard. Now that he's healthy and fit and playing at a high level, it's like, okay, he's a little bit different. As long as he keeps in this vein of form, I'm not going to bring up the idea of trading Jamal Murray. And I really don't want to give up Aaron Gordon if I'm the Denver Nuggets. Can't pay everybody. And if you can use Peyton Watson to unload the Zeke Naji contract, I consider it, even if it's this year. This coming in from the 719, you asked the age-old question in all of sports, Kaufman. Are the Nuggets just filling a jersey, or do they have a keeper in Watson? Well, I think it's the middle ground. Because I do think that with the impact that Peyton Watson has made this season, even before last night, I look at him like, oh, finally, Peyton Watson's hitting. You want to keep that guy. So in that way, he is kind of a keeper. In an ideal world, you would hang on to him. But the NBA is not an ideal world right now for a variety of different reasons. Right? We don't need to get into all of them. Maybe we can get into some. over the course of the program, load management, rash of injuries. Adam Silver saying you just need to watch the highlights, all of that kind of stuff. So the NBA right now is not the ideal world in a variety of ways. I'm just talking about how punitive this new collective bargaining agreement is, this salary cap structure. I would love for the Nuggets to keep Watson and keep him in the role that he has, not last night, but when the team's fully healthy. Because part of the reason why Peyton Watson, I think, looks good before last night was the fact that they're not leaning on him as much with the second unit. He's a part of it, but now you have Valanciunas, you have Bruce Brown, you have Tim Hardaway. So I would love to keep Peyton Watson on the Denver Nuggets, but I love to keep Peyton Watson on the Denver Nuggets at the price he is now. And even if he deserved more money, which he probably does, I'd love for the Nuggets to sign him to that. You can't. You just can't. So I guess in that way, he would be more the former in saying this is another guy that playing with Nikola Jokic looks really good. And therein lies the wrench in my plans for the Denver Nuggets to finally be rid of Zeke Naji's contract by pairing him with Peyton Watson. Don't you think other teams are thinking the same thing I am? Same thing you are? Are we going to get 32-12 Peyton Watson? No, we're not. No, we're not, because we don't have Nikola Jokic. So I don't know if the Nuggets can actually finally be rid of Zeke Naji's contract by simply pairing him with Peyton Watson in basically a salary dump. I kind of doubt that they can. But if Peyton Watson continues to be productive, maybe it presents another way that Ben Tenzer and John Wallace can kind of package it up and try to sell somebody on taking on Zeke Naji's contract. But you can't pay everybody. And I applied it to Christian Brown. They paid him anyway. Okay. If it just stops there, you're probably okay. Peyton Watson's the next guy. Cam Johnson's the guy after that. Can't pay all of these guys. Under the previous collective bargaining agreement, the Nuggets could, and they did. And Josh Kroenke has talked about it. The timing of them winning a title and the desire of everybody, you and I included, for the Nuggets to simply run it back coincided with the institution of these new financial rules. That means if you pay a lot of people a lot of money, you're only going to have about 5 of those guys, and then it's going to be scraps on the rest of the team. You just can't operate that way now. I think Ben Tenzer and John Wallace understand that, but they did play Christian Brown, so I don't know. But look, good on Peyton Watson. Right? I know he's worked really hard. He's a nice role player to have if you're the Denver Nuggets and you're pushing for a championship as they are. But all of this stuff about the timing of him switching agencies to Clutch Sports and now him having this huge breakout game, this all it's trending in a direction of Peyton Watson wanting all the monies, and the Denver Nuggets should not be entertaining that idea. Even signing into a similar deal as Christian Brown, because then you're paying 2 guys almost what you paid Michael Porter, and remember how hamstrung they were with the Porter contract. 719-24-7. 1313. Now, if you'll allow me, I need to take another break. I'll come back with the Broncos conversation. Why the betting odds for the team to make it out of the AFC may not reflect the way you think that landscape looks after the Broncos win over the Chiefs. Get a jump on your holiday gift giving with the Louisa Graf Black Friday giveaway. You can enter to win at extrasports1300.com. What would I win, Ryan, you may ask? How about a sterling silver lab-grown diamond pendant and earring set from Louisa Graf Jewelers? Entries close on Wednesday, November 26th. So just cross that off the list by going to xtrasports1300.com right now. So, big story of the week is the afterglow of the Denver Broncos beating the Kansas City Chiefs and cementing themselves as clearly the best team in the AFC and the favorite to represent the AFC in the Super Bowl, right? Well, not if you're asking the sports books. The latest odds have come out regarding who will represent the AFC in the Super Bowl. And at number 1, you have the Buffalo Bills. Same as before the Broncos beat the Chiefs. Bills had a pretty good game themselves, if you did not catch that the other day. But it wasn't as big of a win as Broncos had. Then at number 2, you have the Kansas City Chiefs, where they were installed as not only the AFC favorites, but the Super Bowl favorites right before they played Denver, and all that game cost them was now they're behind Buffalo. And then, or excuse me, let me say that again. Buffalo was the favorite to get out of the AFC, then the Colts, then the Chiefs, then the Broncos. Or in some shops, you have the Broncos and the Chiefs tied for the third best odds to represent the AFC in the Super Bowl. How is this possible? This question was posed to me earlier by a colleague of mine. Now, if you notice, you're not getting as much bang for your buck if you're betting on the Broncos to represent the AFC in the Super Bowl this week, as opposed to if you would have done it before they played Kansas City. But that game on Sunday, I think, changed some people's perspective. So I wouldn't blame you if you were waiting till after they played Kansas City to decide whether you wanted to put your hard-earned money down on the Broncos to come out of the AFC. So you won't get as good of a price on them now. But if you rank the favorites, either they're fourth behind Buffalo, Indy, Kansas City, or they're tied with Kansas City for the third best odds. So what does that say? Perspectives may not have changed as drastically as they seem to around here. And I think that's why I would remind people, as I reminded a colleague of mine today, that what they think is going to happen is only one part of why odds are the way they are. There is another force that drives these. It's money. It's the money they have coming in. And just a bunch of Broncos fans in the state of Colorado pulling up their favorite sports betting app and putting down money on the Denver Broncos is not enough to move the market. Now, the market has moved, but it moves because of what is happening nationally. And I don't know if you noticed the national conversation after the Broncos beat Kansas City. Kind of felt to me more Kansas City related than Denver related. Maybe I'm not watching the same shows that you are. Maybe my social media algorithm is not tuned the same way yours is. But I saw a lot of national talking heads, which usually sets the national direction. Not saying it's the right direction by any stretch, but what's the national conversation? I think that has more of an impact. And all I see is people on Fox Sports and ESPN talking about what that game means to Kansas City rather than what it means for the Denver Broncos. I don't know if that's been your experience as you have consumed sports media over the last few days. But as I've looked nationally, the fallout from Sunday's game is exactly that. It's fallout. It's the fallout of the Kansas City Chiefs. What does this mean for them? And you could have a problem with that if you want. That's your right, because, you know, the Broncos winning is a big story. But while maybe a lot of perceptions change locally, nationally, it seems like maybe people aren't flocking to their local sports books or pulling up their favorite sports betting app and putting money on the Denver Broncos after that win. Here's the other part of it. I think that the Broncos have shed the fraudulent label. Okay, that was a win along with Philadelphia. They have two of these now. They have two of these wins that going into it, the conversation was Broncos have no chance. Right? That was the conversation going into the Eagles game. No, the Broncos can't. They can't beat Philadelphia. Defending champions. And all the talk going into the Kansas City game was that Kansas City is right. Nobody took anything away from Kansas City for losing that shootout to Buffalo. And they said Kansas City's the team to beat. The sports books had Kansas City as the betting favorite to not only get out of the AFC, but win the Super Bowl. And that was driven in part by the way people were betting. So I think fair is fair here. If the bigger perception out there was Kansas City is back and is a Super Bowl contender again, and the Denver Broncos are frauds, and then the Broncos beat the Chiefs, shouldn't A plus B, shouldn't that equal C? I think it should. Now, the Broncos aren't my favorite quite yet to get out of the AFC. I still have some questions, so I suppose I'm somewhat in line with these bettors. But but not for the reason that I think bettors are still maybe not buying into the Denver Broncos, if that makes sense. I look at the Broncos, and now my mind is starting to go, all right, can they get back to their identity, which is running the football without J.K. Dobbins? Okay, now is one playoff game getting blown out in Buffalo enough of build up enough scar tissue for the Denver Broncos to get in this year and go all the way to the Super Bowl? Those are the kind of thoughts that are running through my head, and also looking around at some of these other teams and saying, I don't know if I buy into the Broncos being the favorite to get out of the AFC. I will tell you, if they secure that number one seed, that's going to go a long way, because I don't think any of these teams in the AFC, even if they look at the Broncos and are not scared of them, I think they look at the idea of going to Denver and go, oh, we don't want to do that. And that's why I said that after the Broncos beat the Chiefs, I think they should absolutely have the number one seed in mind. They should absolutely try and secure home field. Not at all costs. Right? Because we've had this conversation with the Avalanche and the Nuggets before. You want your team as healthy as they can be. So you don't rush somebody back from an injury like Pat Surtain, by the way. If he's ready to go for Washington, then great. But if there's any room for an abundance of caution, I would keep Pat Surtain out another week. So it's not at all costs, but I think it still very much should be the top goal now from the Denver Broncos to get that number one slot, because Denver and Empower Field can be such a weapon and advantage for them, especially if you're making Indy go outside. Or you're playing in better elements than Buffalo would present or Foxborough would present. Because that's the other thing, is that Denver might get a little nasty around playoff time in terms of the weather, but it's not but it has a decent chance of being better than the forecast in Foxborough a particular weekend or Buffalo a particular weekend. So I think securing the number one spot would be another step in the direction of me maybe putting the Broncos as the team to beat in the AFC. They got some weeks before they can secure that. But I'm thinking about stuff like that. How young and inexperienced key members of this team still are. You look at teams that have been more talented, like Buffalo and Baltimore, that have yet to break through. And the Broncos, year 2 of being back in the playoffs, are going to go all the way to the Super Bowl. I mean, I suppose the Bengals are your blueprint for that. But I don't know yet if Buffalo is in the mix, if Kansas City ultimately ends up in the mix. I don't know. In playoff time, it's a different conversation. But I think a lot of people nationally still look at Sunday as being more of a referendum, like, oh, maybe we bought too much into Kansas City. And I don't think that the Broncos have shed that possibly fraudulent label yet. Nobody's really outright saying it, but I think a lot of people across the country are still thinking it. I'll ask you if that's where your head's at. Any part of you still think that what the Denver Broncos are doing is less than genuine? And would you have them coming out of the AFC if the season ended right now? 719-24-7, 1313. Coming up next, are we living in the era of Jokic? Hour 2 on this Thursday. Glad to have you. Appreciate you watching the show on our YouTube channel. Also on various other social media platforms like X, Instagram, and Facebook. Anywhere you go, anywhere you consume sports content, we are there at XTRA Sports 1300. While you're there, like, subscribe, follow, drop a comment. We would appreciate all of those things. I would appreciate all. I don't know who the royal we. I would appreciate it. 719-247-1313 is the way you could call or text into the show. Last night, the Denver Nuggets beat the New Orleans Pelicans, and one of the surprises of that game was Peyton Watson scoring 32 points and pulling down 12 rebounds. But what wasn't surprising was that you got another monster Nikola Jokic performance. He had a triple-double before the fourth quarter even began. His final numbers in 34 minutes, he scores 28 points, grabs 11 rebounds, dishes out 12 assists, 9 turnovers. And with that, according to NBA crazy stats and co-signed by the Nuggets themselves, Nikola Jokic now leads all players this decade in points, rebounds, assists, and steals. And he is the first player in NBA history to lead a decade in 4 of the 5 major statistical categories, blocks being the only one where he is not. So it begs the question, doesn't it? Is Nikola Jokic the player that defines this decade? And my answer to that is he will be. And why I can't say he is, and I'm more speaking future tense, is because I think the 2020s have also been very LeBron-centric, which is not dissimilar from other decades in NBA past. For the player that reigned in one decade to bleed a little bit over into the next decade. Right? The NBA conversation is very much centered around Jokic, but also still very much centered around LeBron James halfway through the decade. But I went back, and you could say, the way I look at it is there one player by himself? Are there 2 players that are on the same line? Or is there one with kind of a supporting actor, if you will, a headline and a sub-headline? You go back to the 60s, I think it was Bill Russell. That was Bill Russell's decade. But right underneath him was Wilt Chamberlain. But a lot of the Wilt conversation ultimately led you to Bill Russell conversations because it was the rivalry between the two of them, and Bill Russell got the better of Wilt Chamberlain time and time again. So I would make Bill Russell the headline in the 60s with Wilt Chamberlain as kind of the sub-headline. Then you go to the 70s. I think that was a decade owned by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And I don't know if there was a second player. Maybe you could tell me at 719-247-1313. But I would make that decade Kareem's decade. Then the 80s come along, and it's Bird Magic. You can't have one above the other. It has to be both. It has to be Bird and Magic. Same line. Then you get into the Jordan era, which was the 90s, or the Jordan's decade, however you want to phrase it. Then you go to the 2000s, and I would put Kobe, because Kobe, remember, got the last laugh in that decade over Tim Duncan. But Tim Duncan would be like on the second line. But I think the 2000s was Kobe's decade. At the beginning of it, it was Kobe and Shaq. And at the end of it, it was Kobe winning a title with Pau Gasol. Then the 2010s was LeBron. And I would, just because I think Steph deserves to be mentioned, I would put him on the second line, but it's very much similar to the Wilt and Russell conversation, except Steph did beat LeBron. But ultimately, when you talk about Steph, it's hard not to talk about LeBron, right? Because Steph inevitably ran into LeBron. Now he got the better of LeBron plenty of times. But you talk about Steph and you talk about that Warrior dynasty, and LeBron is a character in that story, a big time character. He's the antagonist in that story. But I think the player of that decade, in terms of accomplishment, numbers, but also conversation, was LeBron. Now, I think Nikola Jokic, when all is said and done, when 2030 rolls around, hopefully not a day too soon, but when it does, I think we'll look back and we'll say this was Jokic's decade. But right now, we're getting a little bit of remnant of the LeBron decade, the LeBron era, if you want to call it that. I separate decades and eras, and I'll get to why here shortly. But the LeBron decade has kind of spilled over into the 2020s. He did open this decade with a title, if you recall. But it did come at the expense of Nikola Jokic, right? They went through Jokic to win that title. So maybe it's Jokic is on the top line and LeBron is on the bottom line, and soon LeBron will be removed from it. He will keep his decade, which is the 2010s, rightfully so. And this will be Jokic's decade. But you even look, Kareem played with Magic. So the Kareem decade spilled over into the Magic and Bird decade. Kobe won to begin the 2010s. Right? So there was a little bit of bleed over from the Kobe decade to the LeBron decade. So I don't know that you could say it's just Jokic. I think right now, 5 years in, you're talking Jokic with LeBron being on the second line there. But by the end of this decade, I think Jokic is going to own it. And I do think he'll play enough years to own the decade. If that's really the only question that remains, is whether Jokic will make it to the year 2030. I don't know. He may not, but he's going to play into at least 28. He'll play to 30. Come on. What's he going to do? The horses will always be there. Let's stop saying Jokic is going to get out as soon as he can. But I think you have to say that this decade will ultimately be owned by Nikola Jokic, and maybe by himself. If LeBron's really on the outs, and he just came back the other night, looked pretty good, but I don't know what this season has in store for LeBron. We may look back and LeBron, his comeback or whatever, this season was kind of a blip. I don't think the Lakers are going anywhere this year. I think they're down the pecking order. And I don't know how effective LeBron's going to be for the entirety of the season. And even then, is that his team? Will he ultimately, any success the Lakers have, ultimately be attributed to Luka and not LeBron? So while I still think you have to mention LeBron in there right now, as each day goes by, it will become more and more Jokic's decade. And again, you could, Kobe, where's Tim Duncan? Right? You can label it big headline, the Kobe decade, but Duncan's right there, right? It's hard for you to talk about the 2010s and not bring up Tim Duncan. It's hard for you to bring up the 2010s, even though you can give the 2010s to LeBron. You feel like you want to mention Steph. Do you want to mention anyone else in the 90s besides Jordan? No. Not saying that Jokic is Jordan. Please let me be clear about that. But Jokic might have a decade in the end all to himself, like Michael did in the 90s. Now, it won't just be stats, right? He'll have to win. And whether it's another MVP, whether it's certainly got to be another title. It has to be. He has to get at least one more to own this decade. Because if 2 years ago was his only one, a lot of other teams that are going to hoist title championship trophies, and who knows if we might get a certain team in the Sooner State winning multiple. But trying to look into my crystal ball, I do think that the Nuggets win at least one more title with Nikola Jokic at some point. And I doubted that he would win another MVP, but I got back off of that stance. Still leaning no, because most of the NBA audience hasn't arrived yet. It is November 20th. And while Jokic has clearly been the best player in the NBA so far this season, and maybe the biggest individual story so far this season, a lot of basketball to be played, and a lot of casuals are going to be tuning in around Christmas. And if Jokic can keep this up, he's got a shot, but no, I still look at Luka. And that was the guy I said over the summer. May have actually, I think I did pick Luka to win the MVP if I'm not mistaken. I have it written down somewhere. But there is no doubt, even if you go beyond the stats, because I know people start to, say, oh, it's just all numbers driven and it's just stat accumulation. And what about this other stuff? Well, he has a championship. He has a finals MVP. He has 3 MVPs, and it's 5 years in. Right? There's no other player that can put their accomplishments, statistical or not, against Jokic and win. Right? And even when you talk about the last 2 MVPs that Jokic did not win, who did Shea and Embiid beat out? What was the conversation? Shea versus Jokic, Embiid versus Jokic. So even if he hasn't won the MVPs, he's been squarely in that conversation. This has been his decade, more so than anybody else. And I think ultimately, as LeBron, fades into the cornfield, it will even become clear that this is the decade of Nikola Jokic. Now, he might end up having the decade to himself like Jordan did in the 90s, but Nikola Jokic does not have an entire era like Jordan does. What era are we living in that Nikola Jokic is the most important figure in? Tell you that coming up next here on Extra Sports 1300. The 2020s have certainly been Nikola Jokic's decade as he leads all players in points, rebounds, assists, and steals. After another monster performance last night against the New Orleans Pelicans, you throw in 3 MVPs, 2 other MVPs that kind of went through him, or at least he was the other guy. If not Shea, then Jokic. If not Embiid, then Jokic. And he's got a title, which only so many players can say they have a championship in the 2020s. But I was thinking about this too. So all these decades, again, the 60s I think Bill Russell owned that decade, but Wilt Chamberlain was, kind of the second guy in that era that you want to talk about to fully discuss that decade. It's really Russell with Wilt, but Russell's held in higher regard because he constantly got the better of Wilt. The 70s, Kareem. Aaron saying Dr. J. Like I've always said with Dr. J that that he's the player that I most regret not being able to watch. And regret's a weird word to use because I had no control over when I was born, much like you. But that was the player that if I could, maybe it's the time machine thing. If I could go back and watch one player that I never saw live and in person, it would be Dr. J. But I think maybe he's the next guy on that list, but would you say Dr. J helped define the 70s? But Kareem was definitely the guy and define that decade. Then you have Bird Magic, always on the same line, not one above the other. They went back and forth, that whole thing. Then you had Jordan all to himself. That's definitely one. I may entertain Dr. J for the 70s. I will entertain no other suitors for the 90s. Jordan needs to be the only name in that decade, and we just move on to the 2000s, which I think overall was Kobe's decade, but Duncan deserves to be mentioned. LeBron, it was his decade in the 2010s, but let's give a nod to Steph Curry. And I think right now it's Jokic's decade, but I still think there's a lot of LeBron on this decade. He won the first championship of this decade. He's been front and center in so many NBA conversations, and maybe that's what it is. Maybe he doesn't deserve it. I'll pose it to you at 719-247-1313. He did win the first championship of that decade, but how much is when we're talking about the criteria for giving a player a decade, is it really just because LeBron is talked about and you look, because it's not really accomplishment, is it? They haven't sniffed the finals after they won in the bubble. LeBron hasn't been in the MVP conversation. Now he's done things statistically in the decade of the 2020s and with his, now playing in his record-breaking season and playing with his son. I still think there's a lot of LeBron conversation, and that's why I say I'm comfortable with saying by the end of this decade, we may remove LeBron and just make this the decade of Jokic. But right now, there's still a lot of LeBron there. But you can let me know at 719-247-1313. But out of all those players, there's really only one that gets an entire era, which may last a decade, it may not. Jordan's the only one that has an entire era. All of these others, as I'm looking at as far back as I can intelligently speak on basketball, I think Jordan is the only guy that defines an entire era of basketball in the NBA. That's the era is, I think, where you start to rope in more characters. Anything before the 80s, I would label, the era of the big man. And these are working titles for the eras, so don't hold me to them. I'm not trademarking them. But when I think about those times, it's Wilt, it's Russell, even before them, it's Mikan, it's Kareem, Walton. The era of the big man. Then the 80s, I think much of it is Showtime. And yes, that's a reference to the Lakers, but that's also about the style of basketball that was played. And you could throw in Bird and his Celtics. They were a very entertaining team, right? Like, they weren't more entertaining than the Showtime Lakers, but they were a good watch. So when I say Showtime, yeah, it's the Lakers, but it's also a lot of very entertaining basketball being played in that era. And then you go to the Jordan era, right? And then with Jordan's exit permanently, then you saw the next era, I think, being the rise of the Western Conference. The conversation that we continue to have 30 years later is the inequity between the West and the East. Where that conversation started was in that era. And I'm talking about Shaq and Kobe's Lakers. I'm talking about the Spurs, right? And you could even throw in like Dirk. It was just when we saw this pronounced difference. Jordan was gone. The East was greatly weakened, and then it just became wild in the West. Even teams that I think we would hold in higher regard had, the Spurs and Shaq and Kobe not existed. How about those Sacramento Kings teams, right? With Jason Williams and Vlade and Chris Webber, Peja Stojakovic. One of my favorite teams to watch all time was those Kings teams. Think about the Jailblazers with Sheed and Damon Stoudemire. That was a team that you felt like in a different time maybe could have won a title, but ran into, obviously, very famously, Kobe and Shaq, just like the Kings did time and time again. But that was when the West was like, it was all there, and the East was an afterthought. Then, and this can be largely attributed to LeBron James, he's the player of the 2010s. The 2010s defined by super teams, right? Ones that LeBron created, ones that were created because LeBron created one, right? That was the way to build. You got to get all these stars together. Even the Warriors, who were very much built organically in the quote-unquote right way, added Kevin Durant, which I would argue puts them in some nebulous purgatory because because of their financial maneuvering that they did, they could just straight afford Kevin Durant as a free agent. This wasn't Kevin Durant going to his agent and holding out and all that. He was a free agent. His contract was up. He decided where to go. Warriors had the money. It wasn't constructed like the Heatles were, right? It was constructed in a different way, which was slightly more acceptable. But in the end, yeah, they were a super team. And now you have this era that Nikola Jokic being the player of the 2020s, He's the face of it. But this global invasion. And I really like that name. And I like it for two reasons. Because one, it does speak to the number of foreign-born players that are in the NBA. We're talking about right now the NBA having to manipulate the format, even though they're trying to give us what we want. We want USA versus the world. And we're out for blood. We want the international players to embarrass the American players, to allow us, so we can kind of change our perspectives on the game of basketball. More on that in a minute. But the NBA is having to manipulate this a little bit. Oh, we're going to have multiple teams. Why? Because straight up USA versus straight up world, not going to end well for Team USA, right? So it's the number, it's Giannis, it's Jokic, it's Luka, but it's also the global invasion of the international or the European style of play. And you see it certainly with the international players, but even last night, if you're watching the Nuggets game, didn't Derek Queen remind you of somebody? Now, around here, we have a head start on Derek Queen because we watched Derek Queen in the Terrapins knock out, allegedly, the CSU Rams from the NCAA tournament. So we knew a little bit about Derek Queen before the general populace. But last night, Derek Queen had the best performance of his career with Nikola Jokic on the floor and playing the game very much like Nikola Jokic. Jokic was asked after the game how much he likes Derek Queen's game.
He's good, he's good. He has some moves. He's definitely crafty. He's unorthodox. Great touch around the rim, feel for the game. He's a really. It's good to see somebody different.
It's good to see somebody different, but more. I guess now you would say that Derek Queen is different from the majority of NBA players, the way he plays. But it's quickly becoming more normalized. And I think the reason why Nikola Jokic likes what he sees from Derek Queen is because Derek Queen does play the game of basketball very much like Nikola Jokic. Not as good as Jokic, obviously. But he looks a little like Jokic when he plays the game of basketball. And unorthodox, I think, would be a good word to describe it. But you have others. You have Alperen Şengün, who coincidentally will be playing against Jokic tomorrow night. And you have this guy in Portland named Yang Hansen. And he and Queen, same draft class. Two of the more shocking developments on draft night were the Pelicans drafting of Derek Queen and the Blazers taking Yang Hansen. Why? Because the Pelicans traded this year's first-round pick, which will go down as, oh boy, it's going to be bad. It's going to be bad because this draft class is loaded. And the Pelicans are going to be one of the worst teams in the NBA and will not even be able to participate in this year's NBA draft. So that won't be good. But it will make Pelicans fans feel better if Derek Queen becomes a poor man's Nikola Jokic. But they gave up a future first-round pick so they could secure Derek Queen. The Blazers turned heads because nobody had Yang Hansen going that high. But why did Joe Dumars make the trade so he could get Derek Queen? Why did the Blazers, in some people's minds, reach for Yang Hansen? Because both of them play the game like Jokic. Both of them remind you of Nikola Jokic when they play. Teams are now looking for the next Nikola Jokic. Alperen Şengün has been called Baby Jokic. Yang Hansen has been called Chinese Jokic. They're now the market. What did the A's? The market inefficiency. Right now, not everybody has a big man that you could play through like the Nuggets have with Nikola Jokic. But the Pelicans think they do now with Derek Queen. James Borrego, their interim head coach, talked about it last night. Called him a hub. They could play through him, play off of him. That's the long-term vision for the Blazers in Yang Hansen. What the Rockets are kind of doing. I mean, I know Kevin Durant grabs headlines, but watch them tomorrow night. They play through Alperen Şengün. So you're seeing younger players come up that are maybe built a little bit different, maybe not as gifted, athletically, maybe can't run and jump as high as some of their peers, starting to take some things from Jokic's game and saying, well, I can add that. And you have some players starting to emerge that if you squint and tilt your head, you can kind of see the same kind of movements that you see with Nikola Jokic. Nikola Jokic was also asked last night about a generation of players that are coming up, emulating him and playing the game like him.
Yeah, why not? I mean, if that feels good, to leave a mark behind you and like players look up your playing style and want to copy. I think it's cool.
He thinks it's cool. And make no mistake about it, just like I said, we're only halfway through the decade that Nikola Jokic has owned. This is his decade, and it will continue to be. But we will also see, just like the Jordan era or even the Jordan decade, in all of these decades, how many kids grew up wanting to play like Larry Bird or Magic Johnson? How many kids grew up wanting to play like Michael? Well, one of them played the decade right after him in Los Angeles. Right? Kobe Bryant is the most Jordan-like player that we have had since Michael Jordan. And some people are trying to push Anthony Edwards into that, and I see it. But I think we got to wait a little bit. So now we're seeing Nikola Jokic be the influencer for another generation of basketball players, especially ones that aren't in the United States. I don't know how much. I mean, that's why the Derek Queen story is so cool, because he's American born, grew up in this country, and has clearly at one point during his basketball career started watching Nikola Jokic and said, I'm going to take some of that for my game. But internationally, how could Jokic not be the guy that you're trying to emulate? But I think also, too, it's not just playing the way that Nikola Jokic plays, because let's be real about it. There are some gifts that Nikola Jokic has in terms of his height that not a lot of basketball players growing up have. There is the Luka of it all. Luka, I mean, built like an NBA player, but he's not as big as Jokic is. But also this, when I talk about this era being the global invasion, it's also the invasion of the global mindset of fill up every category on the stat sheet, affect the game in so many different ways. Let's be honest about Michael Jordan. He is the GOAT. He will always be the GOAT. I will entertain no arguments to the contrary. Jordan was a scorer and a defender. Now, once in a while, he'd hit Steve Kerr or Paxson, but he wasn't known for his passing. Same with Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant wasn't a guy that you said, wow, look at him. He's filling up every column in the stat sheet. And that's the way an entire generation of American basketball players came up. Good that Kobe and Michael both had defense in their game, because a lot of kids maybe don't prioritize that like they should and understand that that was as much a part of Michael's game as his scoring, and same with Kobe. But we had an entire generation of American basketball players growing up that, on the offensive end at least, all they want to do is score. And then these European players come over like Jokic, and they actually probably want to pass more than they score. They want to assist more. They want to rebound. They want to do all these other things. I think that's the staple of this era. It's just that Nikola Jokic is the player you think about first, and he's emblematic of the era, and he's also inspiring the next generation of basketball players. His decade, maybe not just his era, but he's going to be the player most known for this era of the global influence on the game. And it's funny, too, how these eras play into one another, because the Jordan era led to this era, didn't it? The Jordan era ending led to the next era, which was the West being insane every year, with these all-time great teams going up against each other even to get to the NBA Finals. So the Jordan era ending gave way to the next era, but also the Jordan era led to the popularity of the sport overseas, which got a bunch of young people in Europe into basketball because of Jordan. But they started teaching the game their way. And now that's what you're seeing. So what does this all add up to? In summation, this is all an argument for Michael Jordan being the GOAT, because I am further demonstrating his influence on the game, something that LeBron does not have or never will. 719-247-1313. Try to get to some of these text messages on the topic of basically it's a two-part topic. One is Jokic the player of the 2020s. When you think, and we're only halfway through, but when you think of this decade so far, is Jokic the preeminent player? And then, is this the era of the global invasion that Jokic is the face of? That the world is maybe not depth-wise, but certainly top-line talent-wise is beating the U.S. right now? And the influence of players, us appreciating, I think, players that do more to affect the game in a number of different ways. We all grew up idolizing Michael Jordan, or at least watching Michael Jordan, or at least people of my generation, right? And we all wanted to be like Mike. And what was that? We'd all try to be cold-blooded killers on the court, take every big shot, take every shot, to be honest, try to dunk, and it was optional, but lock in defensively. Like, that's what we should have taken also from Jordan. I don't think many of us did. We just wanted all the stuff he did on the other end of the floor. So taking your thoughts on that, 719-247-1313. Get to a few of them now. We got another half an hour after the top of the hour that we can further discuss this. Albert says Jokic is statistically the best player. Okay, but outside of Colorado, he is not the face of the NBA. The NBA office is in New York, doesn't promote him as the best or even close to the best. He's not flashy. His personality is not marketable. Jokic doesn't have a lifestyle that fits the NBA market. Can't be the player of the decade because no other part of the country cares. I think, don't you think that's changing, Albert? I think that's changing. I think there was a long time where you were absolutely spot on correct. And that played into the fight that we continued to have, railing against the terrible ESPN. Talk about Jokic more, showcase Jokic more, give Jokic his respect. Have you watched ESPN? Any NBA program, they are losing their minds over how good Nikola Jokic is playing. I played the audio a few days ago. Kendrick Perkins is saying only nice things about Nikola Jokic. He's being hyperbolic. He's saying great Hakeem Olajuwon games are pedestrian Jokic games. I think it's changing. And I think what you're saying there was true for a time. I think it's changing. And I think it's another reason why I say now I can't say unequivocally this is his decade. And the guy that I think all those entities that you're referring to would be talking about is LeBron. But I think that's why we're moving in a direction. And by the time this decade is over, I do think we will look at Jokic by himself. And it's like he's the player of the decade. But Aaron pointed this out earlier. He's got to win another title. Right? I believe in what I'm saying, and I think I'm going to be proven right. But if Jokic wins just one, and let's say the Thunder become a dynasty, even as hard as that is to believe with, the second apron and everything, As great as the Nuggets are playing, there's a stupid Thunder, and I say that with tongue firmly planted in cheek because give them all of their credit for being the defending champions that they are. But the only team in basketball that is playing better right now than the Denver Nuggets is OKC. And if Oklahoma City parlays this into back-to-back titles, 3 and 4 years, I think the conversation might change. But if Jokic can put a stop to the dynasty, that would especially help if Jokic beat the Thunder, let's say this year, just because I don't know that people around here want to wait till next year or the year after. Let's just say this year, Jokic puts a stop to what people thought was going to be a dynasty, or at least a back-to-back title run. I do agree with Aaron. I do think Jokic needs another ring. And that's not, I don't think that's ring culture. But if you want to be held up as the player of the decade, I feel like it's okay to say at least one more. I think that's fair. There are other things that go into play, but in a sport like basketball, and ring culture in some ways is a little bit justified because many people grew up who are, have the job I have for a living, grew up idolizing Michael Jordan. And what did he do? He won a championship and they won another and then another. And then he took a break and then he won another and then won another and won another. We have to take some culpability in this ring culture thing, but I also don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Now, I think some people, LeBron, have taken it, too far in their pursuit of rings. I do think we put limits and we say you need to win rings, but you need to do it a certain way. And that's where I think the debate is, can we really say these guys got to win multiple rings and then get mad at them when they put themselves in a situation to win multiple rings? Right? But I do think it's fair to say that if you're going to talk about all-time greats or the player of a decade, that they should have more than just one of the 10 titles that are handed out that decade. I think that's fair. Some other really good texts on some of the eras I laid out. We'll get to those if I don't karate chop my microphone again. We will get to the 3 stories that are driving the show in the more immediate future, including Peyton Watson's big night in the Big Easy. Hello there. Final half hour of the show, Bills and Texans, coming up at the bottom of the hour. Broncos going to sit this one out this week 12. Be a good chance to sit back and watch the rest of the NFL and decide for yourself whether the Broncos, after their Chiefs win, compared to some of the other teams, and probably the biggest game of the weekend, and I don't think this is me being biased. I think a lot of people would label the Colts-Chiefs game as the most significant game of the weekend. But even if you don't look at it from the Chiefs' perspective, don't you want to see the Colts and what they can do? So that's what the bye week provides. And then we'll come back next week and see if anything's changed in my opinion or yours about the Super Bowl candidacy, as it were, for the Denver Broncos. But Bills, Texans, obviously the Bills being one of those teams that's very much in the Super Bowl conversation coming up at the bottom of the hour. Your thoughts in the meantime at 719-247-1313. You could call or text into this show. And perhaps you have a thought on one of the three stories that are driving this show. Yes, they are. And we start with a big night for P. Watt in the Big Easy.
I knew that there was going to be
No, let's do this. I don't want to hear from him. I want to hear him do this.
Nuggets lead at 112-97. What a pass, Joker! Dunk, two hands! Peyton Watson again! Who else? Behind the back bounce pass with the left hand, and Watson threw that thing home. He's got a career-high 32.
Altitude Radio on the call, as heard right here on Extra Sports 1300. Nuggets beat the New Orleans Pelicans 125-118, thanks in large part to a career night from Peyton Watson, 32 points and 12 rebounds. And that really continues what has been a very good season so far for Peyton Watson. He's fit in nicely with that second unit, but last night getting a bigger opportunity with some of the injuries the Nuggets have had, he took full advantage, and for that, he deserves credit. However, this is a good time to remind you and the Nuggets front office, you just got done extricating yourself from a contract that at the time you felt like you really wanted to give out because it was a guy that you invested time in, you took a chance on, you developed, and now you want to keep a hold of that investment. You don't want to let it go. That was Michael Porter, right? And at the time, everyone said, oh, you got to sign him, got to sign him. And I'm not saying I was any different, but times have changed. The Nuggets simply cannot pay everyone. And they found that out the hard way. And really losing the players they have lost, like the KCP thing, it really sapped their bench. Because now a key member of your bench, Christian Brown, is not on your bench anymore, in addition to Bruce Brown leaving, right? What the Nuggets have found out is, one, it's very difficult to pay everybody. If it's impossible. You can't do it. But also, two, they have found out, and even in this short season that we've had so far, that, my God, it is so much more important for the Nuggets to have a good bench. Because the residual impact of that is that Jokic is better, which makes the players who play around Nikola Jokic look better, like Peyton Watson last night, who is the beneficiary of playing a lot of minutes with Nikola Jokic. What the Nuggets have now, they have to hang on to for dear life. And the minute Peyton Watson gets a lot of money, which is after this year, he's a restricted free agent. He just hired Clutch Sports to get the most money that they could possibly get him. It's going to cost you things. And I don't think Peyton Watson is what Michael Porter was for the Denver Nuggets when they signed him. But it's just, you got to be able to have what the Nuggets have now with the bench. And I know Peyton Watson is a part of that. But Peyton Watson is a part of that because he makes so much less money than he's going to make after this year. And you're not going to be able to get the next Tim Hardaway, the next Bruce Brown, the next Jonas Valanciunas in here if you're just saying we're paying Christian Brown. We already paid Gordon, Jokic, Murray. Now we're going to pay Christian Brown, Peyton Watson. Like, that's it. That's all your money. And the Nuggets did need some money to be able to secure the bench unit that they have. The best thing that can come out of this, if it's going to be truly a career year for Peyton Watson, is maybe they can move him along with Zeke Najee's contract to get more flexibility. Unless the Nuggets are going to get a top 10 pick or a top 5 pick, I think it's just shown that the draft and develop, there's a fault to it because the talent coming in is just not. I mean, look how long it took Peyton Watson to hit. If this is the first year that he's hit, he's been with this team for years. You can't wait that long. And if you're drafting in the 20s or in the 30s, you're going to get players like Peyton Watson that are going to take years. And it didn't work under Calvin Booth. And I think that Ben Tenzer and John Wallace should avoid that if they can help it. And they can help it by not falling into the same trap that they kind of did with Christian Brown. Don't fall in love with your players that get to play next to Nikola Jokic. You really have to scrutinize and you really have to decide, is this guy super valuable to our team or is he just playing really well because he's with Nikola Jokic? Watch that game last night and tell me it's not the latter for Peyton Watson. He's been good in the role he's had devoid of Jokic, but why did he score 32 and pull down 12 rebounds? Mostly because he was playing with Jokic. You need to keep the flexibility to be able to bring in the next Hardaway, next Valanciunas. You cannot, I'm just saying now, you can't pay Peyton Watson. You can't. I think there will come a day where they might regret paying Christian Brown, but at least they're not paying Christian Brown and Peyton Watson or paying Christian Brown, Michael Porter money. The bottom line is you can't pay Peyton Watson. You just can't. So what do you do with him? I shop him. And I see if this is another avenue for the Denver Nuggets to be able to finally be rid of Zeke Najee's contract, which gives them what? More flexibility. But a good game from him. Good on him. But we just went through this for the last few years. You got to be careful overvaluing guys that get to play with Nikola Jokic. Speaking of, here's story number 2.
Yeah, why not? I mean, if it feels good, to leave a mark behind you and like players look up your playing style and want to copy. I think it's cool.
Nikola Jokic speaking about the next generation of basketball players that kind of play like him. One of them was on the floor last night, Derek Queen. You have Alperen Şengün, who the Nuggets will play tomorrow. You have the Blazers drafting Yang Hansen, whose closest player comparison is to Nikola Jokic. there are more and more players that are popping up every day that have taken notes from Nikola Jokic, that have modeled part of their game after Nikola Jokic, which adds to what the other piece of Nikola Jokic last night, which is with another triple-double. He now leads all players in the 2020s in points, rebounds, assists, and steals. This will be, by the end of this decade, the decade of Nikola Jokic. Just like it was the decade of LeBron in the 2010s, Kobe in the 2000s, Jordan in the 90s, Bird and Magic, can't separate the two of them, in the 80s, Kareem in the 70s. He will be the player this decade is known for. Why? Because of his statistical achievements. I do think he'll win at least one more title. He may win another MVP. He's already won 3 of them. So he already has those MVPs, but if he gets another, that will move the needle a little bit more. And then you have his influence on the game of basketball. More players popping up that play like him. That's what some of these other names that I mentioned, the impact they had. LeBron, Kobe, Jordan, Bird, Magic, Kareem. The next generation tried to take some of what those people had. We're seeing it with Nikola Jokic. This is not saying that you got to put Jokic above any of the guys I just listed. But by the end of this decade, you will put him above every other player that played in the 2020s. And his impact on the next generation is going to be a part of why. Now let's go hyper local for story number 3. Some news from the Colorado Springs Switchbacks, bringing Stevie Echeverria back for the next 2 years, midfielder. Now this is a player that Alan McCann, the new head coach of the Switchbacks, specifically brought up when he joined me on the show yesterday as a player that embodies what he wants his teams to be in Colorado Springs moving forward. He wasn't the only one. Juan Tejada was another one. But he talked specifically also about Stevie Echeverria and kind of let the cat out of the bag that Stevie was coming back, but now today the club has made it official, a 2-year deal for Stevie. I know this season was up and down for the Switchbacks. You know how it ended, and not just on the field, but also off the field. So in the end, it wasn't what anyone hoped it would be. But when the Switchbacks, I think, had their best stretch of the season, which was after the 4th of July holiday, it coincided with Stevie Echeverria being in the starting 11 every week. I think it was Stevie and it was Quincy Huerman going on a heater. Those were 2 of the big reasons why I think the Switchbacks really got going in the middle of July. I mean, he is that gritty player. Stevie Echeverria is not a guy he can pop up every once in a while with a goal, but he's a guy that's going to stick to his job, and his job is to lock down the middle of the field from a defensive standpoint. And that's the kind of player that Alan McCann wants on his team moving forward. So why go out there and search for the next Stevie Echeverria when you already have one in-house? So very important. I think, look, I don't have inside knowledge, but Alan McCann spoke to this both yesterday and in his quotes to that the team put out. They have other guys coming back. They have other guys that they are going to sign. So when these signings get rolled out over the next few weeks, it is consequential. It is important. It is setting a tone for what the offseason will be, who you announce first. I don't think it's just Stevie's the first guy to sign on the dotted line. I think it is very intentional that Stevie is the first guy mentioned of, hey, guess who's coming back? Under new head coach Alan McCann, this seemed to me like a must. And great to see Stevie back. Great culture guy. Important role on this team. And he'll be in Colorado Springs for the next 2 years. 719-247-1313. Get to the remaining text messages before Bills and Texans at the bottom of the hour. Don't forget, tomorrow, take a turkey to work day, where we are partnering with Bullseye Plumbing, Heating, and Air to help gather food and donations, turkeys specifically, if you want to be on brand for the day and the season, to donate to Care and Share Food Bank of Southern Colorado so they can make sure as many families in our community as possible have the Thanksgiving that they deserve. So, few different ways for you to give. You could drop off a turkey at any participating King Soopers location in Colorado Springs and Pueblo, which I believe is all of them. Some of my radio colleagues here, if you listen to Magic FM or KKFM or KVOR, Peak FM, Cat Country, any of those. I know you listen to this radio station 24 hours a day, but maybe someone you know listens to a different radio station every once in a while. Crew from those stations will be out at the King Soopers location, Constitution and Mark Sheffel. So if you're in the neighborhood, drop by and see them. And then, of course, there's also a very powerful way to help out, and that's by donating online. You could go to extrasports1300.com and donate, because food banks have a greater buying power than the average consumer. So if you want to stretch a dollar as far as it can go, you donate it to a food bank. So if you can give, that would be awesome. We'd be very grateful, and I know the folks at Care and Share would be as well. So that's tomorrow, Take a Turkey to Work Day. More information, all the information you need at extrasports1300.com. Let's get to a couple of texts here. We got Bills Texans momentarily. This from the 719. What if you called the 90s, the Jordan era, and the Dream Team decade? But couldn't we just say, I mean, let's look at it for what it is, not to diminish anybody on the Dream Team. Wasn't it Michael? Like, really? Like, wasn't that a part of Michael's story? In The Last Dance, it was Michael. People were there to see Michael. So I don't want to diminish, Bird and David Robinson and all these guys, because Stockton, Malone, there are other players in every decade, right? Every decade doesn't just have one guy. But can you tell the story of that decade by simply saying Jordan? I think you can. The Dream Team was a huge part of it, but the Dream Team, it is Michael. It's kind of like, Wilt Chamberlain, one of the most significant players of the 1960s, of course, but he kept running into Bill Russell. So Bill Russell kind of gets the decade. It's kind of his. Bird and Magic were too back and forth to just give it to one guy. Kobe Duncan, I think there's an argument. Even with Steph, you're still talking about LeBron. Even if Steph bested him. I think the Dream Team certainly was a big aspect of that era and of that decade. But ultimately, I put that under the Jordan umbrella. This from the 719. I hear what you're saying. I mostly agree with everything, but the one thing that I've had a hard time with is LeBron, because he broke off and had to create super teams to win championships, whereas the Joker did not. Now, but because you're right, let me be clear here. So are you saying that you have a hard time making the 2010s LeBron's decade? Because that also fell under the super team era. And I'm not saying every era has to be a good era. Does Taylor Swift have a not so good era? I guess I should not ask. I'm not going to I'm not going to Jade Barron anything today. I'm not going to get on those people's bad side. I'm just saying not every era is a great era. You may look at an era and say, like the steroid era in baseball, terrible. It's bad. At the time you loved it, but after the fact, bad. Super team era was, I don't think, the NBA's best moment, but it was what that era was defined by. And the player who was the face of the super team, LeBron James, was the best player, most significant figure in that decade. And when I say that LeBron is still milling about in the 2020s in that conversation, it's not because of necessarily that many accomplishments, but he's still very much a part of the zeitgeist. And I don't think Jokic is dominating all the conversations. There's still a lot of LeBron in there. Good conversation. Glad it always makes me feel good when you guys latch on to one of these topics and we can have a back and forth about it. So I very much appreciate that, as well as your patronage. Even if you didn't reach out, just listening or watching the show is greatly appreciated. I will be traveling tomorrow for women's basketball. That is on Saturday. And plus we have Air Force hockey early in the day tomorrow. So I guess enjoy your weekend. Coming up next, Bills Texans on Extra Sports 1300.